you all this morning, and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So God is on a mission. Apparently that's the message, and one of the messages that we get from our texts for today. A very eclectic group of texts, right? They kind of flow from the story of Noah, and then they talk about Jesus after his resurrection going down to minister to the souls who are in prison, as Peter says in his letter. And then we jump backwards again in time. You have to try and keep track of all these time changes, right? It's like a sci-fi movie almost. Where are we now? So we start with immediately after the flood, then we go to after the resurrection, then we come right to the beginning of Jesus' ministry, where he is baptized, sees the Holy Spirit descend upon him, says something very important for his own self-understanding and his mission. You are my son, the beloved. And then he is sent immediately out into the wilderness for this time of testing, then begins to deliver his message, begins the actual physical human mission of Jesus, God in the flesh on earth. So we've kind of morphed through a bunch of different time periods. And what I think holds these lessons together is the fact that they all reflect that central reality. God is on a mission. What is that mission? God is on a mission to do what? Well, certainly, as we gather together this morning for worship at the beginning of Lent, I think part of that mission is for God to take sin seriously. Take sin seriously. Lent is our opportunity as Christians to kind of focus, not necessarily, and it's important to keep this all in perspective, right, and in balance. Lent is our opportunity to focus on our own sinfulness, not in a way that simply leads to beating ourselves up, feeling a sense of disappointment about who we are, and leading us into a sense of despair. That's not what Lent is for at all. Let's use as our theme verse not just for our gathering this morning, but for our reflection during Lent and our opportunity to grow as Christians in our understanding of God's presence with us. Let's use as our theme verse that verse from the psalm that we read this morning. God's compassion and love are everlasting. As the psalmist considers his or her own position in life and relationship to God and asks that question that we all ask, what can we depend on? What is reliable? What do we know centrally about our relationship with God? The psalmist says this: your compassion and love are everlasting. So anything else we say about God or about ourselves, all has to be considered under that reality of God's compassion and love, which are fundamental qualities of God. Fundamental qualities of God. If you get any indication about God, anybody witnesses to you about a God who is not compassionate and loving, then they're only giving you either part of the picture or a skewed picture to begin with, right? Can we agree on that much together? So when we have some people who want to tell us that God is present to beat us up, to catch us at every wrong turn, that God is a God, primarily a God of judgment, we know that we're not getting the whole story. We know that we're only getting a part of who God is, and maybe not even an accurate picture of who God is. And it's important to remember that. I was talking to somebody just the other day about this picture of God, which is true, it's scriptural, about God being a God of judgment. And it seems to me, and I've probably mentioned this to you before, that when people are really strong on preaching about a God of judgment, they're talking about a God who judges other people, and for them, their God is a God of love and compassion, right? God is loving and compassionate to them, but if you're not inside their closely prescribed circle of right behavior, right belief, all these things that we call orthodoxy, right? That's right belief. If you're not inside their circle, then God is a God of judgment for you. But for them, God is a God of compassion and love, because they're drawing that circle pretty small. They're not giving you the whole story. So as we enter into our Lenten pilgrimage together, we're going to remember that verse from Psalm 25, that God's compassion and love are everlasting. And I want to suggest to you that it's because of that reality that we can enter into this Lenten pilgrimage, spiritual pilgrimage at all. Because if we have a God of judgment, if God's primary approach to us is waiting to catch us when we slip, when we make a mistake, or to use our own religious language, when we sin, if primarily that is God's approach to us, then why get into that at all? Where does that lead if we reflect on our sinfulness and find that we have a God who's waiting right there to hold us guilty for things we already hold ourselves guilty for? That only leads to that sense of despair or hopelessness, of a kind of a dead end in our faith. God's waiting to get you. And once I acknowledge that I've done things that God can get me for, which I must acknowledge, if I'm not depending on God's compassion and love, if I'm only dependent on God's judgment, the minute I acknowledge that I have done things that make God liable to get me, I have no hope. Because I'm acknowledging that God has good reason for consigning me to wherever God decides to consign me. We're not going to use the word, right? We're not going to use the word hell because it's a scary word. I was reading something the other day. I thought this was kind of funny. A student of St. Augustine, one of the great church fathers, a really deep thinker, who had a powerful conversion experience of his own. A student of St. Augustine said to him, "What was God doing before God created everything that exists?" And after thinking about that for a minute, can you imagine that? Think about that for a minute. How would you even answer that question? Well, it's for good reason that St. Augustine is the father of the church. He said, God was creating hell for people who ask impudent questions. That's why he's St. Augustine. I'm not. You know, that threat of hell that sort of hangs over our religious atmosphere, maybe especially as Christians, but not exclusively as Christians, right? Our Jewish sisters and brothers certainly believe in hell, as do our Muslim sisters and brothers, and many, many other people, and it has different names. If that is our destiny, then we should not be engaged in this Lenten pilgrimage, because it just becomes too much a heaping on of our own heads of that sense of guilt and hopelessness and despair. So we're going to engage in our Lenten pilgrimage, trusting in the love and compassion of God, which are essential and eternal and everlasting to God's nature and character. Then we can begin to look together at what this mission is that God seems to be on through the book of Genesis and in Peter's understanding and then in Mark's gospel. And simply this, God's mission is to save. Okay? God's mission is to save. Now we have to bring that down from the abstract, right? Because just to say God's mission is to save, we haven't found the focus, the object of that verb to save. To save what? Heard a joke about God giving Moses, giving Jesus and Satan a test, a challenge in heaven. And that was to see who could write the longest and most articulate theology. And they each get their computers, and they're working on their computers, and they're working away for hours, and they're just about done, and the power goes out. And Satan is like, "Oh man, all that work, I lost everything." And he looks over, and Jesus is sitting there smiling. And Satan gets angry. He says, "Why are you smiling?" And Jesus says, "Because Jesus saves." But we know that that's not the focus of Jesus' saving activity, right? It's not to save Word documents. It's not even to save in general, but Jesus saves you. Jesus saves me. Jesus saves humanity from the threat and eternal punishment of judgment. Okay. You with me so far? Now we can hear that on an intellectual level. Okay, yes, Jesus saves. But I think we need to hear that on a very personal level. But not limit it to the personal. The challenge that we have, right? To believe that Jesus saves you, there's the object of the verb, right? Jesus saves what? Jesus saves you. But not only to limit it to the personal, I'm saved, and I don't know about the rest of you. That's your problem. Work it out. Hope everything goes well. That's not our faith. Our faith says that God is on a mission manifested in some very powerful ways in Jesus Christ to save all of humanity. So reflect with me for just a minute on 1 Peter, right? 1 Peter tells us interesting event in the life of Jesus, or what we might call the afterlife of Jesus, right? That is recorded nowhere else in Scripture, but says this is what happened. Because it was a question in the Christian community. So if Christ was crucified on a Friday and raised on a Sunday, what did he do on Saturday? I guess it's an okay speculative question. Well, Peter answers that question. He says that what Jesus did, what Christ did, was to go down to hell to save those who were there, who had disobeyed God prior to Noah and the flood. And this scene in our imaginations has been depicted in art, and it's called the harrowing of hell. Like the overturning of hell, right? When you harrow a field, you turn it over to prepare it for crops. Well, Jesus goes in there and he turns hell upside down. And that's called the harrowing of hell. And that's what 1 Peter tells us he did on Saturday. To save those who, at the time of Noah, had disobeyed God because they needed somebody to come and give them the message so that they could hear it in a way that was compelling and then be saved, be liberated from hell. That's part of God's mission, to save people, to save humanity, to save us as individuals, but humanity as a community. That's what God is about. God is so bent on that mission that God says to Noah and his family after the flood, look, I'm putting a sign to remind me, as if God needs to be reminded, right? I'm putting a sign in the clouds to remind me that I am a God of compassion and love. Isn't that interesting? Like God would need that. Right? That's what the bow is for. So that after it rains and the sun comes out, God sees the rainbow and goes, oh yes, I've made a covenant, I've made a contract, I've made a deal with my people, that I'll never wipe them out by water again. Which sounds good, right? Despite all the water mess we have in the world and the lack of, the shortage of and the abundance of. Marion and I were up in Massachusetts over the past 3 days. There was snow in places that was over the first floor windows of houses. People couldn't get out. Can I tell you a little story about your dad? Karen Snowberg remembers growing up in Wisconsin, and the snow was so high in Wisconsin, right? Yeah. That you couldn't open the front or the back door. So she remembers her father climbing out the dining room window to get to work. That's an abundance of water, right? That's just, and God says, okay, but it's not enough to drown you all. So I don't know, what that means about the dire predictions for global warming and global flooding that we've experienced. But God says, I'm not going to wipe out humanity. I guess, here's a thought, right? God says, I'm not going to wipe out humanity by a flood. God didn't say you could do it to yourself, didn't say you could do it yourself if you want. But I'm not going to do it, so you guys are on your own in that respect. But there is this covenant promise that God makes to continue to save God's people. And it's almost like what the writer of Genesis is trying to share with us in that covenant that God makes is that God will remain patient. At the time of Noah, God was like, that's it, I'm done. I've had it up to here. I don't know what's the matter with you people. I created you good, and look at what you've done with all that, so we're going to start all over. Fresh slate, wipe out everybody but Noah and his family. We're going to start again. By the way, are you guys biblical scholars? How long, here's a question for you this morning just to keep you engaged. How long does it take after Noah and his family get off the ark for people to sin again in terms of generations? How many generations do they maintain their own goodness before somebody screws up? None?
Yeah, they start already.
Right away. Bang, like that. It's Noah's son that starts. Noah gets drunk and something happens there. And yeah, so here God is going to start all over again, and maybe God could have chosen better. I don't know. It's just a story of humanity, right? But then, if God was, all right, if God thought, okay, just like 40 more days of rain and we'll wipe the whole thing out, there's that bow in the clouds to remind God, I've made a commitment. I've made this deep commitment because of who I am to these people I've created, to continue to invite them into relationship with me so that they can find out who they are and stop worrying about who they're supposed to be. If we take a look at Mark's gospel, I want to suggest to you that the whole scenario of the temptation of Jesus, which Mark doesn't give details. Did you notice Mark doesn't give any details? If you have Matthew and Luke in your head, you're like, well, where's the temple and where if you turn these stones into bread? None of that. Mark says Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days tempted by Satan, and the angels ministered to him. All good, right? He apparently resists. So for Mark, the focus isn't on the details. For Mark, the focus is on the fact that Jesus, who is God, was tempted. Well, what's that all about? It's a reminder to us, think again about that covenant that God makes. I'm never going to wipe my people out again by a flood. I'm so committed to them that at a certain point in history, and we're not talking about, high school history. I'll give you guys up for learning a German word that's a good German word. It twists your tongue around, right? Here's a good German word for you. It's called Heilsgeschichte. That's good. You know a good German word when it makes you almost spit, right? Heilsgeschichte. Heilsgeschichte is a word because many of the early biblical scholars were German. They came up with this word, and what it means essentially is holy history. Heilsgeschichte is holy history. And so at a certain point in time in Heilsgeschichte, in the holy history, God decides that God is going to enflesh God's self, right? God's going to take a human body and walk among us. And that presence, that, what do we call that in the church? Anybody know the fancy word we use for that? It starts with an I.
Incarnation.
Incarnation, right. That incarnation of God in the flesh, fully God in a human body, who is Jesus the Christ, is God walking among us to let us know that we're not alone. That God's on a mission to save God's people. And what does that look like? That means I'll be tempted like you're tempted. I know what your experience is. I think too often in our life of faith, we are not aware of what God is up to. We think that God might be busy somewhere else, too preoccupied, or just not caring enough about what's going on. That's never true. And God in the flesh, Jesus the Christ, tells us that God has entered into our human experience to know exactly what we're going through. Whatever that is, whatever your experience is, God knows it, and God's desire is to be with you in it and to save you through it. So, are you with me so far? Kind of strung a lot of stuff there together, aren't you? God's desire is to be with you in it and to save you through it. So that God continues to work to save God's people. So Jesus identifies fully with our experience so that, as St. Paul will tell us, when he is lifted up, we are lifted up. That his being lifted up on the cross, being subject to death, is because we're subject to death, and in fully taking on our experience in order to redeem it, that's why Jesus is crucified, but then raised, so that as he participates in our humanity, we can participate in his holiness, in his new life. So 1 Peter will later on in the passage that Rebecca shared with us this morning refer to baptism, and we'll say that baptism is not a washing of dirt from the body, but an appeal to God for a good conscience. What do you think that means? What does that mean, an appeal? Baptism, think about your own baptism, that your baptism is an appeal to God for a good conscience. Anybody have an idea what that means? Because it seems to be like the central point in that passage of the letter where Peter's trying to make it all apply to us, apply to the Christians to whom he's writing. So what does it mean, an appeal to God for good conscience? This is as far as I got in my sermon preparation, so now I'm sorry. What's that?
Morals.
Morals, okay. It's an appeal to God for morals, like give us right behavior. Okay, baptism certainly brings us into that. Hopefully, right? That's what we say in the baptismal promises. We're going to lead a life worthy of Christ. Anybody else have an idea? Other suggestions about what an appeal to God for good conscience means? All right, let me take a crack at this too, and you can let me know what you think. That in baptism, kind of like what you're saying, Bill, we're grafted into this relationship. We're bound together with Christ in baptism. And think about what we just talked about in terms of he participates in our death so we might participate in his resurrection. If we're, I'm moving again, Paul. If we're bound to Christ in baptism, then what are you worried about? Because you are now one with Christ through baptism, that you come up out of this baptismal water a different person than you came to it. What are you worried about? It's no longer, St. Paul will say, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And that's not just for him. That's for every believer. That because you've been baptized, you are now bound together with Christ so that his life is your life. And you don't have to be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, God is going to nail me for this and that, if you'll pardon the pun. God's going to nail me for doing this thing and that thing and the things that I've thought and the things that I've done and the things that I haven't done, and make that whole laundry list of things that bother you and trouble your conscience because you haven't lived up to expectations. Which is not an excuse, mind you, for just saying, oh, the heck with it. But rather is to say that your baptism is an appeal to God for good conscience. In other words, don't worry about it. You're forgiven. You have Christ's identity, not just your own. And those two are melded together in you in a very unique and particular way. So you don't have to fear the fires of hell. Because you've been bound to Christ in a resurrection. And you're part of God's mission, right? Then you're part of God's mission, God's Heilsgeschichte, God's holy history, that it comes down to focus finally in you. And don't worry about judgment. Karen Nurmi is fond of quoting a theologian who said that in baptism, the only death we have to fear is already behind us. The only death we have to fear is already behind us. We died to self, we rise to Christ in baptism, and now we're free to live that way. So the last thing we need to do, the last thing we need to do in our life of faith is to engage in false humility, self-oppression. I'm not good enough. God can't possibly love me. I've done so much wrong. God can forgive other people. Forget all about that stuff. Our conscience has to be clean and good because we've been united with Christ in baptism, and therefore we are free to do those things, those acts of love and compassion, just like God does, what we call our morality as Christians. We're free to do those things, not in order to get God to love us, but because our God already does. And it's in that spirit that we enter into our Lenten journey, that we reflect on our sinfulness, not so that we say, oh my gosh, look how terrible I am, but so that we can appeal to God to free us from those things that draw us away from God and others, so that we can live fully for God and others, because that's how we were created. And that's the mission that God is on, to save, to help us be part of that. So God invites us into that mission, which I have to say, in so many ways, you do so well. The love and compassion of this congregation, the ways you reach out to so many people, despite the many calls for help. Over and over again, you say yes and yes and yes, and that's part of God's work in the world. And again, we don't do those things so that God will love us. God already loves us. But we do those things because God has freed us to live that way. So I'm inviting you then, finally, during this Lenten pilgrimage, to read, focus, pray, take a devotional booklet, get yourself immersed in that compassion and love of God, which are everlasting, and realize that it gives you a new identity and freedom and a clean conscience. And for all these things, we are grateful to God.